Last week we did neo-Darwinism. This week we're going to be talking about natural selection. So I don't know if you guys remember anything from last week. Yeah, I'm seeing shaking of heads, which is why we do a review, because hopefully we're going to dovetail each new week into the previous week. The last week we were talking about what makes neo-Darwinism different from Darwinism, and we said that one of the big issues is the new aspect of it, is the recognition that we now have of Mendelian genetics that we did not have in Darwin's time. So that now, see, Darwin really didn't have much of an idea about how traits get passed down from generation to generation, but it was Mendel who really came up with the statistical analysis of how traits come together between parents into offspring. And so the neo-Darwinian aspect, the neo of it, is really the new understanding of genetics that we have, which is really the descent aspect of descent with modification. But what Darwin contributed was the natural selection side of the picture, which is what we're going to be really talking about today. So we got into the question of, well, what is evolution then? What even is it? Because it's very important that we define our terms well. And the best definition, I said, that we've really come up with is one by Ernst Mayr, and that definition is, I got all carried away here, changes in trait or gene frequency in a population of organisms from one generation to the next. And I'm going to make this point again and again today, that this is actually a very, very low bar for evolution to get over. Evolutionists want to point around and say, see, it's happening. Everywhere we look, it's happening. But the question is, what's happening? And we're going to get into that very thoroughly today, but let's ground this in this, definition of evolution, because we're going to return to this basic idea, and that is a change in frequency of a gene or a trait from one generation to the next. So we're talking about a statistical distribution here. Okay, we're going to really get into detail today about what really is implied by this notion of a statistical distribution. So evolutionary theory then is just the set of laws that define how traits and gene frequency do change within a population over time. That's what neo-Darwinism now, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, is attempting to accomplish. And so we have random mutation, and we haven't talked a lot about random mutation, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. It's actually not a very contentious subject. The genome does change randomly. It's a truism. It's so well known today that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious to the organism. They're not good. The organisms that have their genomes mutated either are unable to successfully breed and pass that along, or it ends up so hurting the next generation of organisms that they quickly die off and don't reproduce. And so, in general, it's such a truism that random mutation does not tend to introduce new beneficial information into the genome of organisms. It tends to harm the organisms in which the random mutations occur. But very, very, very rarely mutations occur that actually end up changing the genome in a way that is at least potentially beneficial, if not neutral, possibly beneficial. And it is this that Darwinists fixate on as the source of the new information that could possibly produce genetic changes and lead to, ultimately, speciation events. But all evolutionists immediately grant the fact that random mutation by itself, even when it's positive, is not sufficient to account for all of the changes that we see in the species on planet Earth. Dawkins is a classic example, the most vociferous evolutionist on the planet, who will immediately say, pure randomness is not sufficient to explain the ordered complexity that we see in even the simplest genome. There's an ordered complexity in the simplest genome. And randomness is not going to get you that. So the mechanism that really matters is the mechanism of natural selection, which is the filtering process, the directing. And I don't mean intelligent directing. It's blind. It's the blind watchmaker, as Dawkins says. But this ordering occurs on the neo-Darwinian synthesis by natural selection. And so if ever there was an aspect of the theory that the weight is on, it is on natural selection, which is what we're really going to get to today. So, as I say, much weight is placed on natural selection because randomness alone cannot explain the ordered complexity that we observe, so the mechanism of the ordering can't be in the genome itself. It has to be an exterior filtering process. And so natural selection is really designed to be a full-blown mechanism. It's a principle of ordering the information in the genome. So it is the theorized process by which members of a given generation, some of which contain a modification in their genome, get selected to reproduce or not. This is sort of the party line of what natural selection is supposed to be accomplishing. So this is kind of a review leading us to where we are today. Are there any questions about where we are at the moment before we dive in heavily into what natural selection is really about? Any questions at all? Okay. Darwin, famously, in later editions of The Origin of the Species, referred to natural selection as also survival of the fittest. And this is the most commonly thought of line now, or phrase, when people think about natural selection, is survival of the fittest. And Darwin himself treated this as really a synonym for natural selection. Darwin actually did not like the phrase natural selection the more he got to think about it, and the reason is because the term selection implied to a lot of people design and the idea of a plan and the idea of, rather than a passive filter, which is how Darwin thought of it, they thought of it as a really almost intelligent direction of the process of evolution. And Darwin wanted nothing to do with that. His emphasis was on the natural part of natural selection. And so he believed that survival of the fittest was a more passive phrase that didn't build in anything about supernaturalism or anything like that. So that's the ideal. That's what natural selection is supposedly doing, is you have random mutation getting introduced into the genome. That ends up resulting in morphological differences in some subset of the organism, the population of the organism. And as a result of that, the environment impinges upon these morphological changes, and some die as a result of this morphological change. Hence, the genome that underlies that morphological change doesn't get passed along to subsequent generations. This is the ideal. This is the way natural selection is supposed to work. And there are all kinds of examples of it, right? But the critiques of natural selection have been going on since the inception, and the critiques have stuck on one particular aspect more than any other, and that is that the phrase survival of the fittest is actually just an empty tautology. Rather than being actually an explanation of a real principled mechanism that is taking place in the world, it's a totally empty phrase. So for a minute, let's talk about what a tautology is, because we're going to rotate back and come back to this basic concept again and again today. So what is a tautology? Let's take a phrase. My dog is black. Now, this is a statement. It's not a question. It's not a command. I'm actually making a statement. It has propositional content. Well, in this case, the propositional content is conveyed in a typical subject-predicate fashion. My dog is the subject. The predicate is black. Is, are, and so forth are called the copula. So what's happening here is I'm making an assignment of a property, namely blackness, to my dog. I've got a subject, and I'm saying, my dog possesses this property. And so I'm informing you about my dog. I'm giving you information via the predicate. Now, there are alternatives to this notion of a tautology, but we're going to focus on this one because this most closely aligns with Darwin's whole survival of the fittest idea. There are logical tautologies that are true just in virtue of their structure, but we're not going to get into those, or mathematical truths. We're going to focus on subject-predicate tautologies today. Now, let's contrast that with my rose is a rose. Well, we've got, again, a subject and a predicate. But notice that in this case, the predicate is literally the same thing. The exact same conceptual content is contained in the predicate as in the subject. And so, this statement, my rose is a rose, is absolutely true, but it's true by definition. It's true by what we call analytic containment. If you analyze the subject term, you just get the predicate term. In this case, it's flagrantly obvious, but compare this one. Bachelors are unmarried males. Now, on the face of it, that seems informative, but it's actually not, because if you understand the subject term and you analyze what the subject term has in it as conceptual containment, you just get the predicate. And so there is a feature of all subject-predicate tautologies, and that is they're true by definition, and they're false by contradiction. So a tautology, then, is just a subject-predicate statement, like the last one, in which it's just strictly true by definition. It's not conveying any informational content. You're not learning anything new about bachelors because of this predication. And this is what it's claimed is really going on when we talk about survival of the fittest. So let's talk about what the fittest is. Darwin says, well, natural selection is equivalent to, it's synonymous with, survival of the fittest. Well, we know what survival means. What is fitness all about? And ultimately, it's those things that survive, right? I mean, how do you know that something was fit? Well, it survived and reproduced, right? And so, in the end, you have a subject-predicate phrase that basically says, those that survive are those that survive. That's survival of the fittest. Clever recognition, right? I mean, people are thinking this through and saying, all right, you're trying to hand me a principle. You're trying to tell me how this works. But when I start trying to figure out what you're really saying, I'm left with emptiness. I'm left with you not really explaining anything at all. And so critics have really bashed on this, and the more they've bashed on it, the more evolutionists have kind of backed up and said, well, how bad is this really for us? Is this really a problem? Do we really have no account whatsoever of what natural selection is? So evolutionists have come up with some pretty neat outs. The first, and I think a completely legitimate response, is to say, look, even if the phrase survival of the fittest turns out to be a bare tautology, the phrase is not equivalent to the theory. We tried to explain the theory via the phrase, but if that phrase doesn't work, fine, we'll come up with another phrase, but the phrase is not equivalent to the theory. The theory is substantial even if the phrase is a mistake. Did you have your hand up, Tracy? Okay. Survival is not the same thing as fitness. This is another very substantive response. The reason is because evolutionists can now distinguish between different sorts of survival, if you will. One of the ways they distinguish it is to say, look, there are mutations in the genome that don't produce morphological evidences. The organism externally and functionally doesn't change as a result of these changes in the genome. So there's nothing that natural selection is impinging upon, and we call this differential survival. But we can distinguish between organisms that survive completely apart from natural selection from those organisms that survive because of the filtering process of natural selection. And the very fact that we can distinguish between the two means there's two senses of survival, which means that survival doesn't just equate to fitness in a natural selection point. Now, that's a significant point. We're going to come back to that later. I want to be sure you understand this. Differential survival, what is that? So this is organisms that have had a change in their genome, but it hasn't manifested itself in any way morphologically. So these organisms survive, they reproduce, but because there was no morphological difference, natural selection never impinged upon that difference. And so they survive, but not in a fitness sense. Fitness is not an issue in this kind of survival because we're not talking about a differentiation in morphology. But then there is traditional fitness survival, which is when there are morphological changes, and natural selection does impinge upon those. And so when those organisms survive, it can well be said they were more fit, they were selected. So one form of survival is differential survival, and natural selection is not working on it. And the other form of survival is the traditional fitness survival, in which natural selection is working on it. Is this making sense? Are there questions about this?
Yeah, I had a question, because this came up years ago when I took an anthropology class, and they were driving home the point of, take a look at your knuckles and the hair on your knuckles, and to see which, some of us have hair on our first joint of our knuckles. Some of us also have hair on that middle joint of our fingers. And they were saying that, in driving home this point of survival of the fittest, that trait has been carried over for some of you, but for some of you, it's no longer with you.
Yes.
And I look at that and say, what's the point? Why drive home that point?
Okay, yeah, because for evolutionists it is a very significant point. It's one that I'm glad you raised this, because we're going to actually tie into this. Because I've said this same phrase again and again, and I'm going to drive it home now. Evolutionists will say morphological changes, however slight, can be impinged upon by natural selection. And so the point that they're driving home with this is, you would think that whether you have hair on this knuckle or that knuckle or both, you would think that's an utterly insignificant trait. But from the point of view of an evolutionist, there is no morphological difference that is insignificant. There's no such thing as an insignificant morphological difference. So they will emphasize the stepwise process of evolution is so granular that whether you have hair here and here or just here can matter. However slight is the phrase you will see again and again in the evolutionist literature, because they're trying to emphasize the fact that the tiniest morphological differences can be impinged upon by the process of natural selection, and hence affect the ultimate direction the species goes.
And then does this tie into what you said last week, was the more of these subtle changes, when they begin to accumulate, where they reach a tipping point and something?
Yes, and there's two senses of this tipping point. You're asking some really, really good questions, Pastor Troy. Okay, so the first sense of the tipping point constitutes what we're talking about with differential survival, where you're getting changes accumulating in the genome, but they have not yet manifested themselves morphologically. So the individuals are continuing to survive and reproduce, but natural selection is not impinging yet on these changes that are occurring in the genome. So because natural selection is not impinging on it, they label it something else. You're still surviving, You're surviving to pass changes down, so it's survival in the evolutionary sense, but it's not survival that natural selection is impinging upon because the changes have not yet accumulated to bring about morphological differences. Once morphological differences start to appear, however slight, natural selection now can begin to impinge upon those, and as it impinges upon those, it can refine and select and direct, not in an intentional way, but nevertheless filter and direct now the process of evolution because there's something there to work with. The environment now has something to impinge upon and filter out and say, no, hair on this knuckle, not good, we're not having it. So individuals that possess that trait, they're going away. But individuals who have this other trait, they get to survive, they get filtered in, they're part of the mix for the next generation, and so the additional morphological traits that accumulate, ultimately, right, the theory is ultimately this accumulation of new morphology ultimately produces an organism that is different enough from the original that, well, now we're getting into speciation events, which is next week and the following week. What exactly do we mean by one species branching off of another? What would that constitute? How would we define that? That's a huge issue, which is why we're going to spend 2 weeks on it. But yes, the party line is that ultimately a tipping point occurs and you get a speciation event because enough morphological differences have accumulated. Yeah, so that's the process. Notice now, however, at this context, that what we're really talking about is the response to the tautology critique is that fitness is not just equivalent, it's not just synonymous with survival, because we can talk about two different kinds of survival, and from an evolutionary point of view, they are very different kinds of survival, and so there is survival in the context of natural selection, and there's survival not in the context of natural selection. Therefore, some survival isn't equivalent to just fitness. Hence, survival is not the same as fitness. Hence, fitness doesn't mean just those that survive. Hence, we don't have a tautology. Furthermore, and this may be the most pressing and sort of obvious response, is that, look, it's patently ridiculous to look around at all of the evidences we have of natural selection at work in the form of adaptation and claim that there is not a substantive mechanism in play here. There's obviously a substantive mechanism in play. So if we've made a mistake in how we phrase what it is, so be it. Again, that's not the theory. The phrase isn't the theory. We're trying to figure out how to cast or encapsulate or define what it is that's going on, but clearly it's going on. And so the idea is natural selection, however we define it, we may dink around with trying to figure out how to define it, but meanwhile, there's something real going on there. We'll figure out how to define it. Any questions about this? The responses to the tautology. The reason that I bring this up to you, even though now I'm saying it's not really a significant critique, is because so many creationists, religionists, intelligent design people still refer to the tautology critique as though it's a real and damaging critique of Darwinism, when in fact, there are very good responses on the part of Darwinists to say, yeah, we get it, we see your discomfort, but look, mellow out, this isn't an issue, okay? Back off. You're not really threatening the theory because you have a problem with a particular phraseology. But in the literature, you will constantly see appeals to Darwinism, natural selection as a tautology, and so in the interest of being responsible and intellectually honest, I want to make it clear to you, I don't believe that that particular critique is a pressing one upon the neo-Darwinistic paradigm. All right, well then what is this mechanism? Remember that the entire weight of the theory hangs on it. The neo-Darwinist synthesis is Darwinistic, and that means at core natural selection. So the weight of the paradigm hangs on what natural selection is and what power it has to accomplish the processes we just talked about, the slow accumulation, tipping point, speciation events, and so forth. So, if it really is an observable mechanism, and it really has the power to direct, to take randomness and order it, then there's something substantive going on here. That's what we need to understand what it is. Still not quite over this cough. Now, here's an important point. Any such mechanism has to be generally applicable. You can't just point to a particular evidence and say, there it is, that's what I'm talking about. You need to find the thing that is the same about all the examples. Are you understand what I'm saying? It's not sufficient from a scientific point of view to say, see, there, that's what I'm talking about. Because now I want to ask, what are you talking about? Let's say, for example, that with some kindergarten kids, I throw out a bunch of shaped and colored blocks. And as Dana can tell you, this is a test that they do with kindergarten kids to figure out how they're processing information, how they're advancing. So you throw out a sphere, you throw out a cube, you throw out a pyramid-shaped thing. One's blue, one's green, one's red. You throw out a rectangular block. The cube is blue, the rectangular block is green. You start asking these kids, which go together? What are alike? Well, it's legitimate if the kids grab all the green shapes and pull them together and say, there, they go together. It's also legitimate if the kids ignore the color and pull out the squarish, rectangular-ish things and put the, and then pyramid-ish type things and so forth, right? And you ask them then, tell me what it is that makes these alike. They now have to refer to a general principle. They can't just say they're alike because look at this and look at this and look at this. They're not getting it if they can't encapsulate the particulars into a general principle. That's precisely what we need from natural selection. It's not sufficient for Darwinists to say, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. Something amazing is happening, because the question is, what is it that's happening? Define it for me. Put it into the form of a general principle. That's what scientific theories are supposed to do. They're supposed to hand us the general principles that guide the events that take place in physical reality. Is this making sense? Yes?
And then there's a lot of assumptions also because it's not the scientific fact. Okay. And then there's also lots of assumptions throughout history and science and scientists with their theories.
Yes.
Simply because they just feel that maybe, everybody has the right to their own opinion.
Scientists definitely, as we've been discussing in past weeks, you're exactly right. There's a lot of presumption that goes on in scientific theorizing, and just as is the human condition, right, most of our presumptions are hidden to us. We don't recognize the presumptions we're bringing to our perspectives, and it's difficult to back up and say, really, I'm kind of smuggling this concept in when I'm thinking this. And yeah, scientists do that a great deal.
The closest fossil that we have to Jesus would be the shroud, maybe. I don't know if it's been factual or anything that's. I don't think it's really been like a DNA test type thing, and even that could come up a little. But it's possible because of the multi-millions of Because at that particular time, and then to determine how old something really is, that's another data.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're getting into a lot of related points, and some of these we're going to be touching on as we go forward. But we're trying to be really systematic and take it in a very stepwise fashion. So we'll get to some of those points going forward. For the moment, we're going to really focus in on just the aspect of the scientific presumptions built into natural selection, what that really is for them, how they think about it. So we expect them to produce a general principle. It's not sufficient to, like, let's say the kid pulls out a green rectangle and, you know, a purple. Now, if they pull out a bunch of totally unrelated things and put them aside, that's not necessarily wrong, is it? Because let's say that in the mix, you also have some non-geometric shapes, blobbish kind of things that are sort of undifferentiated and there's no similarity on sides, or maybe there's no sides at all, right? Maybe the kid turns out to be really, really advanced if she does not differentiate on the basis of color, or does not differentiate on the basis of shape, but instead says all of these have sides and planes and all of these do not. Right? We recognize that as an even more advanced recognition of a general principle. But we need general principles. It's not sufficient to hear a bunch of particularities. Particularities can be examples, but they need to be examples of the general principles. So let's look at the paradigm example and see if we can figure out the principles that they think natural selection is about. Now, we talked about this last week, right? The peppered moth. And I gave you some quotes last week that I'm not giving you this week about how this is the single most dramatic, right? The word dramatic is used. This is an amazing, dramatic evidence of natural selection, evolution at work. And it's happened right before our eyes. So if there's any example, and next week we're going to get into a bunch more because we're going to talk about speciation events and examples that are trotted out of speciation events. This is the most classic example of adaptation, natural selection at work. And if you'll remember, this is a result of, in pre-industrial England, as the industrial era hit, you get all this soot in the air from tons of factories, literally darkens the tree trunks. Now, the most common light-colored moths, like you see on the right, that were the vast majority, 98% of the moths at that time, were the light-colored moths. When the tree trunks darkened, over the course of decades, the distribution of the trait got turned on its head until 95% of the moths were the dark-colored moths. You can't even see them in this picture. They fit the tree trunk perfectly. And so the Darwinist says, look, the light-colored moths stuck out like a sore thumb. You have the birds now able to trivially pick out and pick off the light-colored moths. That trait gets filtered out generation by generation until you're left with mostly dark-colored moths because they camouflage well, so the birds aren't picking them off as easily. And this is the paradigm example of natural selection at work. In fact, this example is so compelling that the vast majority of creationists have totally capitulated on the idea of adaptation by natural selection, and they've labeled it microevolution and contrasted that with macroevolution. So most creationists have completely adopted the idea of microevolution, but said, you haven't demonstrated that it's possible to cross the gulf between micro and macro. This is a problematical argument, however, because evolutionists immediately respond, you haven't demonstrated what the in-principle problem would be with crossing that gulf by a series of little steps. It's pretty obvious to us that that's what's happening. We see the peppered moth, for example, in the fossil record. Obviously not as often as we'd like to see it, But there are mollusks, the horse lineage. We've got some great examples in the fossil record of stepwise changes from one species to another. And there's the peppered moth dramatically happening right before our eyes in our own lifetime, showing us the power of natural selection to cause adaptation in an organism. And that's all evolution is. You just keep rinsing and repeating that often enough, and you'll get something different. And you creationists haven't yet given us a principled reason why that can't be the way it works. That's just what we see as the way it works. So to distinguish between micro and macro evolution is a tenuous argument. You have your hand up, Alan?
Yeah. The thing with the peppered moth is it is still a moth. It didn't become a beetle, a spider, a snake, something else. It is still a moth. It's just a different
So
color.
far. See, you're exactly right. I mean, your intuition is exactly the creationist intuition. And the evolutionist response is, look at what and I'm going to emphasize this again, dramatic effect we're able to see in a period of a few short decades. Rinse and repeat that kind of thing for 1 million years, and you will get something different. You just haven't waited long enough. We've already told you the process is very slow, can involve tiny, tiny incremental steps. Remember the phrase, however slight. So you put a bunch of however slight morphological differences together, and eventually these produce enough morphological changes that you have a speciation event. So you have to explain what's wrong with that perspective. It looks to us like that's what's happening. You don't like it, but you bring a bias into it. But we can do good. I mean, we can do much better than the distinction between micro and macro evolution, and that's what we're going to do today. There's a better response than to say there's this gulf between micro and macro evolution. There's a gulf, but it's not that one. And creationists, intelligent design folks, should be much slower to capitulate on this front of microevolution and adaptation. We should be focusing much more heavily on what natural selection actually is. We want a general principle. Have we gotten that from scientists? So that's what we're going to be talking about now as we go on. So the principle is here, and this is by a famous evolutionist, I think he wrote this in 1984, Elliot Sober. Fitness is a probabilistic disposition, a propensity to survive and to reproduce successfully. It is connected with actual reproductive success the way a coin's bias is connected with actually landing heads more often than tails. So let me explain what he's really saying here. Let's say you have a coin, and you come to find that it has a trait. And that trait is it's more slightly weighted toward heads than toward tails. It's not a perfectly fair coin. Now, all things being equal, and assuming perfectly fair coin flips, you would assume then that this thing is going to come up tails more often than heads. It's not going to be a 50-50 distribution. Now remember, Mayer's definition of evolution, right? We're talking about a statistical distribution of a trait through a population. This definition is critical because you're going to see the same kind of thinking throughout discussion of even natural selection. We're not talking about peppered moths go from being light-colored peppered moths to dark-colored peppered moths. That's not really what's at issue. That's an example of a probabilistic distribution. Let me see if I can illustrate this really quickly on the board. So let's say that at this end of the continuum, here we have dark-colored moths, and here we have light-colored moths. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the distribution was way out at this end, right? The distribution of the coloration trait had light-colored far more distributed in the population than dark-colored. In fact, it was, at this end, 98% of the moths were light-colored. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, things completely changed on their head, and it wasn't quite 98%, but you end up now with a distribution out here at 95%. We're not talking about, from an evolutionist point of view, from the point of view of natural selection, we're not talking about the peppered moth, a particular individual. Is it light? Is it dark? We're looking at the population as a whole, the population of the species, okay? And I'm going to emphasize this. We're talking about the species. We're talking about the distribution of the trait, statistically speaking, through the species. Now, you're exactly right to note they're still moths. The even more interesting point is it never goes to 100% one way or the other, right? Even as a result of natural selection, you still end up with 2% dark-colored moths. The trait for dark color is still in the species. And even after, and I want to repeat, the most dramatic evidence of natural selection we've ever seen in our lifetimes, even after this most dramatic evidence of natural selection at work, natural selection does not filter out completely the light-colored moths. You still end up with a 5% distribution of light-colored moths here. Now, you have to get your mind around, remember, we're constantly trying to get into their paradigm. You have to get your mind around what the significance is of this to them and why they define things the way they do. They define things in terms of a probabilistic distribution of traits because that is how you correlate the evidence with the theory. The bridge between the evidence and the theory is not. They're not going to tell you what you'll see is natural selection acts out the light-colored moths. They're not going to tell you that. But if it doesn't act out the light-colored moths, inquiring minds want to know what about the species really changed. The genome of the peppered moth remained the same. Are you seeing the point? Natural selection did not impinge upon the genome of the peppered moth. It merely changed the distribution of a trait, statistically speaking, within the population.
So isn't that the reason why they're still holding on to Lucy so incredibly? Even though it's been falsified, they want to show that there was a process of an in-between stage, but if this were the case, it hasn't totally been eliminated. We should still see some that are in the various stages, right?
Yes, exactly. And so that is why they're perfectly okay with there still being crocodiles, and they're perfectly okay with there still being apes, right? Because those, if I can do another little quick diagram here, what those are reflecting then is the branching of the tree of life, right? Because the tree of life, from the evolutionist point of view, you start out with a little single-celled organism here, and you get little single-celled organisms, and then at one point, suddenly you get multi-celled organisms. But these still continue.
Yeah.
And then this branches again. The little multi-celled ones, they still continue, but you get some branching now, right? Now you get like little bugs, and I'm not going to draw bugs because you'll laugh at me, but, right? And so the idea is the distribution is sufficient to accumulate changes morphologically that ultimately become this tipping point that you're talking about. And so that explains why we still have bacteria. Why are there bacteria? After hundreds of millions of years of evolution, those should have been just completely selected out, right? Because now multi-celled and more complicated things are better selected. That's why they exist at all. So how do these end up continuously selected over hundreds of millions of years? Well, it's because they occupy different ecological niches.
We still have single-celled organisms.
Yes.
So could you challenge them on that premise to say that with, like the peppered moths, the fact that it hasn't completely selected itself out, there's something faulty with their theory?
They're not going to say that. What they're going to say is, no, this is exactly what evolution predicts, because, again, it's actually worth to be able to refer to this. Again, let's do dark-colored, light-colored, and so we end up now with a distribution, again, out here that's 95% dark-colored, but that means we still have here 5% that are light-colored. So the idea that the evolutionist has is you get enough over here, put that together with some additional mutations and morphological differences, you get now another kind of branch like this one, right? In which now, let's say that these are, let's take this and expand it out, and what you have now is a new distribution where of these, now you have some with like long wings, and here you have some with short wings, right? And same kind of distribution occurs. Some kind of selective process occurs, and you end up with 95% of these guys ending up also now having long wings. Put that together with, say, maybe a slightly enlarged thorax, and 95% end up now having also the slightly enlarged thorax. And over time, these 95%ers keep accumulating more and more morphological changes. This guy still exists. Put enough morphological changes together, these guys ultimately start occupying a different ecological niche. So they're not competing directly against these guys anymore. And in the end, you have a totally different species here that's occupying a totally different ecological niche than the original. But the original still exists, maybe as a minority population, but it's still there. Okay? This is the party line. This is how it's supposed to work. But notice what the general principle is. The general principle is cast in terms of a probabilistic distribution of a trait. That's what we observe. So that's the general principle that evolutionists are trotting out as what natural selection is able to do. Natural selection is able to change the probabilistic distribution of a trait. And that's precisely what we see in the case of the peppered moth. So Meyer's definition of evolution is, again, in this same probabilistic terminology. It's all about distribution of a trait within a species. Pile enough of them up, you get a new species. And the example does seem to show a difference in trait distribution within the species with environmental impingement, namely bird predation, as the cause. But we got to watch out. Yes?
Now, this is just like a product of your environment type scenario.
Yes.
Chemicals, pollutions, so on. Because
Ultimately,
now this
yeah.
is happening in England, you say, Great Britain?
It did during the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah, so the early to mid 1900s.
Okay, and then possibly, what's the statistic on these type of
That's what we're getting into.
occurrences?
Yep, that's exactly what we're getting into. So
Are we-
pre-industrial.
Now, is this documented through the university colleges of London and the
Oh, yeah,
United
yeah.
States?
Oh, this is a famous example. I mean, every single biological textbook points to the case of the peppered moth as this grand triumph of evolutionary theory.
That maybe it just happened to survive at a particular time, but sometimes because of, like you were saying, the birds will pick them off and so on. Now, if like somebody was trying to get rid of a certain type of insect, or they would trap them with pheromones and either destroy them or take them to a different location where they're possibly needed for farming and so on, to save that species for those type of purposes. And then they will evolve into a more useful purpose in that.
Yeah, I mean, the evolutionists are going to say, yeah, we see examples like that as well, right? I mean, we see examples where we try to kill off a bunch of insects by using a certain chemical. But a tiny subset, 2%, 5%, whatever, they have a natural propensity to resist this chemical. So they survive. The environment impinged on the species, but a subset survived. So whatever that trait is based upon, whatever genetic difference there is that makes that trait occur, that now is what's going to get passed along. And so the next thing you know, the whole population, with a few exceptions, is going to have resistance to that chemical. We see the exact same thing happen in the case of bacteria. As Wendy well knows, this is precisely the mechanism that takes place with bacteria developing resistance to various antibiotics. Some tiny subset of the bacteria have a resistance to a given antibiotic, and because the antibiotic kills off 99.9% of their buddies, they end up being the only ones populating the culture. They they multiply, and soon you have an entire culture of bacteria with a very few exceptions that are resistant to the drug. So we see countless evidences of this process at work.
And it couldn't have gotten to that certain stage in the larva stage if the environment didn't allow it to progress into a moth.
Right. So, okay, you're getting into a totally different issue, and it's a totally valid one, and that is, which time slice is the relevant time slice that we're going to be talking about what's changing within the species? Okay, so yeah, very good point. This is a huge question. And on the online materials, I hadn't intended to get into that level of detail during the lecture, but in the online materials, please refer to that, because I go into some detail about the time slice problem of doing this kind of analysis. There is a significant problem with what's the relevant time slice in which you're doing the evaluation. And for example, since we've raised it just as a bare moment, as a quick example, in a time slice of 60 or 70 years, we see the change from light-colored to dark-colored. But from the point of view of geological time, that's not even the blink of an eye. Why is that a relevant time slice about what's happening? Let's say that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, this all gets undone and we go completely back to 98% light-colored moths. Well, if you blinked your eyes and didn't catch this one, you would have zero evidence that any change had taken place in the species. So there has to be something about the time slice in which you're doing the evaluation. Let's say that early on in the process, where the light-colored moths went from 98% to 97%. So now we pick the time slice to do evaluation in which we're sitting, instead of here, we're sitting right there. Now, has anything statistically significant happened in this population? Wait, you're all shaking your heads. You're all going, no, no, obviously not. Wait, remember the phrase, however slight. If it's detectable, evolution at work, okay? Right? But what makes a step even a statistically significant step? Because the evolutionist is looking everywhere for evidences that this is occurring, every time slice is a good one for them. Are you seeing the point? But we can step back and say, if you go from 98% to 97%, and then 2 weeks later back to 98%, nothing has happened. You're still within the margin of error, statistically speaking. Nothing happened. That's a very legitimate critique, and it raises the question then, how much of a change in what time slice is statistically relevant to use as evidence of a process occurring? When all you care about, when your whole definition, when your bar of success amounts to nothing more than a change in statistical distribution of a trait within a population, that's a very low bar to get over. And so yes, evolutionists see evidences of this everywhere they look. We're going to get into what the really core problem is with this. Questions so far? Are we all on the same page about what they're thinking?
Doesn't that ultimately come back to that a rose is a rose?
That's where we're headed. It's not quite that flagrant. Okay, those that survive is a very flagrant tautology. This ends up being a grand circle rather than a just bare flagrant tautology. But there is something fundamentally circular about this perspective of natural selection. So we're going to look at what evolutionists would tend to appeal to initially. I'm going to call it the argument from change. All right, you hear the word evolution used constantly. And evolution at this point becomes synonymous with change, okay? So here's the argument from change. Reality, for us, is temporal. We live in time. Metaphysically speaking, from an evolutionist point of view, it's temporal, right? If you're Einsteinian, you have the space-time continuum. Time is in the metaphysics. But the passage of time, for us, just is events taking place in reality, changes in reality. As Kant put it, changes in the substratum. Whatever it is that makes up reality, changes occur in that reality, and that's how we detect that time is passing. Reality in time, then, just is a reality of change. Reality for us just is a reality of change. Evolution just means change, and change just means evolution. Therefore, reality itself is evolution. Right? Everywhere we look is evolving. If all you mean by evolution is change, that is a circular, if you will, almost tautological notion of what evolution means. Any questions about this? This is a crucial argument. I'm going to come back to this again. Okay? Any questions? This is making complete sense to you. Okay. But that's not what evolutionists think is going on with biological evolution. They recognize how bare of a circularity that is, right? They think something more substantive than just changes in reality is what they really mean by evolution. Biological evolution is something else. They're not just appealing to the argument from change. Natural selection is supposed to be doing something more than just changes in reality. Because if you were to say to me, I'll tell you all about natural selection. Cool, tell me. Okay, here's what it is. The environment has change. I'd go, you haven't told me anything. You've handed me the argument from change. You haven't explained natural selection to me. You're not differentiating natural selection from other processes, right? You're just telling me natural selection just is reality, because reality is a reality of change. You haven't told me anything. You haven't explained anything to me. You haven't set apart a theory and said, I'm going to point out to you something different and special that works. So they're not just appealing to the argument from change. They need change to be much more substantial than that. They need change to mean something detectable, other than just events in the universe. They need it to be something you can differentiate. They need it to be, here we had a 98% distribution which completely changed to a 95% distribution. That is a detectable, obvious, dramatic change. That's not just general change in the universe. This is something you can differentiate from just change in the universe. This is change in a species in a detectable, a statistically significant way. And I'm handing you their party line. This is how they process this. But watch out now, because here is where they start smuggling in some key concepts. So now we're going to look at the natural selection argument from change. This is a little longer. This one takes 2 pages on our screen. The environment changes over time. True. Right? That's just the argument from change. A population of organisms exists in the environment. True, obviously, right? Traits within the population change over time. Now notice, we're not yet appealing to natural selection. We're just saying things change in organisms, right? You do, you're aging, right? Changes occur in you, the organism. Changes occur in the species that is humankind. Over time, these changes occur, right? Nothing contentious about that yet. Now we're getting into some interesting stuff. Traits more or less fit a particular environment at any given time. Really? I mean, you know, that's not that contentious, right? I mean, you're looking at it going, yeah, I mean, okay. You know, if you happen to be, for example, a 400-pound guy and you're trying to get into the airline bathroom, you have a problem. You don't fit the environment all that well, right? Was that a bad example? Was that not politically correct? Okay. You get the point. You don't fit. We have traits. I mean, I have a certain personality type. I'll get serious. I don't fit in a lot of different company. My personality, you would never say that, right, Pastor Troy? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we all find that in various ways we don't fit the environment perfectly. We have traits, the species has traits that don't perfectly map onto the environment. Okay, nothing all that significant in 1 through 4. But now things get much more interesting. The environment pressures the population to better fit. That's what natural selection does, right? I mean, this is the claim, yeah, natural selection filters certain organisms that don't fit. What kind of filter is natural selection? I've said this before. It's the death filter. Either the organism dies itself, the particular individual dies, or it doesn't get to reproduce, so the potential next generation is stillborn. It never even occurs. It kills off the next generation before it ever even exists. Or the next generation comes out and is immediately killed off because of the trait. Natural selection is the death filter. That's how it pressures organisms to better fit. The population's traits change to better fit the environment. The peppered moth, right? The peppered moth. Look, there it is, 6 right there, undeniable. The traits changed to better fit the environment. You want to not get eaten by birds? Be dark colored. You want to get eaten by birds? Stay being light colored. The light colored ones don't fit the environment pressures the organism via predation, the death filter, killing things off. And what does it kill off? The things that don't fit. Here you go, natural selection, the party line. The environmental pressure is what we call natural selection. Therefore, natural selection pressures trait changes in the population. Looks pretty tight, doesn't it? And you're going, are you arguing for or against evolutionary theory?
Right.
And you should be asking that question, because if we're being intellectually honest, we better be presenting the evolutionist point of view as they would present it, right? We want to do a proper and fair and charitable job in intellectual honesty of what they really think. So I'm doing my best at that. And I believe, from everything I've read, that an argument like this is the best thing that you can say an evolutionist is thinking about natural selection and how it works. And this is consistent with their definitions. Natural selection causes trait distribution to change statistically within the species. Is this just a grand appeal back to the argument from change? Is this just a pretty bare, much more verbose, but pretty bare circular argument? What is it about the population that is supposedly being pressured? Well, in this case, it is coloration, right? The trait of coloration is what's being pressured. That's what's being filtered against. That's the statistically significant trait. Trait distribution changes over time with or without natural selection, however. Remember, all the way back, I'm pulling this back together now. Remember, one of the responses to the tautology argument was there are at least 2 types of survival. There's differential survival, and if you can remember, what distinguishes differential survival from natural selection survival or fitness? What's the difference? You're like going, I had it, but then that was almost an hour ago.
That's right.
And no, I don't have it anymore.
That's right.
Okay? Differential survival is changes within the organism that have not yet manifested themselves morphologically. So they don't get selected upon. But they are nevertheless traits of the organism. They're traits that are genetic traits, but they haven't yet accumulated enough to be morphologically evident. So one way out of saying natural selection is a tautology is for them themselves to say, wait. Traits change in organisms having nothing to do with natural selection. Are you starting to get a feel for where this is going? I know this is hard. I'm not trying to be paternalistic or anything to say I know this is hard, but this is conceptually abstract, but it matters. I mean, ask yourself this question. How can so many smart people be evolutionists and be so wrong? Because it's complex and difficult and abstract to tease out what's really wrong with the theory. You cannot, I've said this again and again, and I'll repeat it again and again, you don't beat evolutionists by debating them on the evidence. You don't beat evolutionists by beating them down about how you perpetrate education. You don't beat them using the standard approaches, because they're just going to say, you don't get it. You don't understand how we really think and why it's so compelling to us. So you have to get in, really get into their paradigm and get into why it is compelling to them, but then be able to back up just enough to say, you smuggled that in, and you smuggled that in, and you smuggled that in. You're saying this out of one side of your mouth, and you're saying this out of the other side of your mouth. It's subtle, but that's what you're doing. So this is hard, and I fully recognize it's hard. I recognize it's subtle. I recognize it's very abstract. But this is how you beat evolutionists at their game. We're not going to debate the evidence. Give them the peppered moth. Give them every way they want to interpret the peppered moth. Give them all their evidence. But look at the inferences they draw from the evidence. That's what we're doing. That's the NS argument from change. And I have this online, by the way, so that you can review it later. The NS argument from change is how they think about the peppered moth example. So we got to get into it, tease it out in inferential fashion. Well, what's going on here is one of the steps in the NS argument from change is that natural selection is doing this impinging and is causing this trait distribution to change. But they themselves say, no, that's not the whole story. Sometimes traits change not according to natural selection. So that's point one. So evolutionists have to get beyond correlation to causality. There was a study I read at one point, and I don't remember, I've looked for it now online and I can't find it, but there was a study that was done in which, I believe it was in Michigan, they found that the number of Protestant ministers, the number exactly correlated with the divorce rate. As the number of Protestant ministers increased in the state, the divorce rate climbed, and as the number of Protestant ministers declined in the state, the divorce rate declined. And over a significant period of time, it was a couple of decades that they were monitoring this, they saw an exact correlation between the divorce rate and the number of Protestant ministers. Now, typically, when you see a correlation that follows both up and down, statistically speaking, we think of that as causality. But there's a second point that has to go into causality, and that is the general principle of the mechanism that's making that correlation apparent. It's not enough to just say there's a correlation, even up and down. You have to explain what's making the tie. You have to give an account of what the mechanism is. No such thing was ever forthcoming, right? I mean, you don't want to say, and no one was able to demonstrate, Protestant ministers cause divorce, right? No one is claiming that that's the result. And if it were the claim, you'd want to know how. Is it like really bad marriage counseling? I mean, right? So you want a theory, you want an account, a general principle of what is making this correlation happen. Time slice problem. After a couple of decades, the correlation all came apart. We tend to think that general principles hang together throughout time, right? There's consistency in the universe. So when does correlation become a cause? Bird predation on a certain color. Lots of birds eating lots of light-colored critters. Obvious cause, right? Well, maybe. Maybe not. What is natural selection actually causing? And to answer that question, we have to get into the huge question. Remember I wrote species up here? What is a species? Everything in their definitions depends upon a statistical distribution change within the organism, or the species is another way of saying it, right? To be able to detect a statistical variation, you have to be able to define the boundaries of the population you're talking about, right? What if it turns out that this organism really should have been defined to end right here? Well, now suddenly there's nothing all that dramatic about the distribution change, right? Now you might even say if it ends here, there's not even any statistical significance in this change. So to get statistical significance in this distribution that you're talking about, you have to be able to very, very accurately define what the actual boundaries of the population in question are.
And who or what defines those boundaries?
Well, that is the big question, and we're really going to get into that heavily in the next 2 weeks where we talk about speciation events and we get into what is a species, because you might want to say, in this case, well, the species is the peppered moth, particularly the peppered moth that existed in England, particularly the ones that dwelt on tree trunks, particularly during the time slice of the Industrial Revolution. But notice the point. When you say a statistical distribution of a trait in a population, you got to be very careful that you're not circularly defining your population such that you get the statistical change you're looking for. Because we're not talking about changes in the genome here. In this paradigm example, the genome doesn't change. The species stays the same. It's even more the same than that it's still moths. You're exactly right, Alan. They're still moths. But they're not just moths, they're the peppered moth. They're the same thing, despite the fact that this statistical change has occurred. And so the question becomes then, how much power are we really seeing in natural selection to change species when in fact even the way a species is defined is a function of what traits you're going to pick out? What if instead of saying the peppered moth is what we're talking about here, instead I say, actually, the traits I think are statistically relevant are the light-colored variant of the peppered moth. Well, guess what? Nothing happened there of statistical significance. Or if I say, I'm talking about strictly the dark-colored moth, well, nothing happened there of statistical significance. And it doesn't do to say there's more of them. That's not an account. There's less of them, there's more of them. How I define my boundaries, what I call the organism, is a function of what traits we're talking about. So it's the set of traits that defines what counts as the organism. And some traits are secondary or tertiary traits. They're not really definitive of the organism, right? They're not definitive of what? Again, next week we're going to heavily get into this, and you're going to see how this all correlates. But the bottom line is, the most common notion of a speciation event is that you have a population that can no longer interbreed with the original population. But keep in mind, it's about different kinds of traits. A pile of traits is how we define what an organism is. Reproductive success is one trait. We can call it a primary trait, a definitive trait of where species boundaries are located, but we're going to see next week and following, that's not necessary. That's just one way of defining a species or an organism, and even more interesting, scientists find themselves between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, a species must be very well defined because evolutionists need to be able to point to speciation events. They need to be able to say, look, we see in the fossil record this species change and become this species. In real life, we see, for example, a certain sort of, not newt or salamander, it's a, I'm vapor locking on the term here. It's a little lizard. We're going to get into it next week. There's a classic case of what they call ring speciation. Believe me, we're going to get into this thoroughly next week, but where they demonstrate at the top you have a certain species. As it moves down a mountain range and becomes geologically isolated, morphological changes start occurring, and by the time you get down to the bottom of the mountain range and these two species come back together again, they're a different species. And so they're going to show you a speciation event that occurs by morphological changes over time, changes in the distribution of traits within a species to the point where now these two come down and they're different species. We're going to talk about that in a lot of detail. But the key point comes down to, what's a species? How do you define a species? So out of one side of their mouths, evolutionists need the notion of species. They need it to be well-defined, and they need it to be demonstrable, because they need to be able to as evidence, point to speciation events and see, we see it. It's happening right before our very eyes. We see it right here in Northern California. On the other hand, that's rock, here's hard place. A species, on the other hand, has to be this very fungible concept, right? There's nothing in principle different when we draw out this tree of life. There are no hard, clear, bright lines. There's no difference in principle between a bacterium and you. There's just a bunch of little steps, but it's all fungible. There aren't clear, bright lines. Creationists are the ones that want to say there are kinds, and there's no switching from one kind to another. Well, that's precisely what evolutionary theory is designed to thwart. There are no kinds. There are no clear, bright lines. There's just this fungible bunch of morphology changing in the grand continuum of life, right? You have this uninterrupted continuum of life from single-celled organisms at one end to Homo sapiens at the other end. We're the most complex things we know of on planet Earth. But it's a continuum. There are no clear, bright lines. So evolutionists need it. I don't just say want it. They need it both ways. They need speciation events that are clear, bright lines, and they need the concept of species to be fungible enough that you don't get into the morass of Christian kinds. So defining what the population is necessarily and only about what are the relevant traits. Back to the peppered moth. We have a set of traits. Here's one of them. It's the one we're going to focus on, changed. None of the other traits changed. Why is it important that none of them changed? Well, because if a bunch of them changed, you're no longer talking about the same population, right? You don't have enough of a set to say that population and only that is what we're talking about. So you have to define the set of traits that count as the population. Then you can single out the trait that you're going to call statistically significant. And then you can see natural selection at work. But I think you're already seeing how much circularity is really fundamentally built into this, because again, there's a great arbitrariness in what set of traits and in what time slice you're going to evaluate what a population is. So here's the second rock and hard place. Evolutionists need natural selection-produced change to be true genetic change, not just a statistical distribution. Is this really an evidence of evolution? No, it's not. Nothing genetic changed. Trait distribution changed within, now I'm putting it in scare quotes, a population. But that's not evolution. So you've got to somehow get from this definition of evolution, Meyer's statistical definition and Sober's notion of natural selection as a statistical definition. You've got to get from these statistical definitions to somehow genuine, substantive, genetic changes caused by natural selection. So they need that. On the other hand, all of the definitions and the NS argument from change all argue in terms of this soft notion of change, this statistical distribution notion of change. And here's why. Because they can point to hard place. They can show you evidences of the hard place definition. They can't show you evidences of the rock definition. They can't show you evidences of the thing you really want to see happening. That there isn't evidence of. So they have to make, again, I said there's a gulf, but it's not the gulf people think there is. There's a huge gulf between the rock and the hard place. There's a huge gulf between the statistical definition of change and the kind of change that's actually relevant to what natural selection is supposed to be having the power to do. That gulf has to somehow get bridged. And in the literature, all there is in bridging the gulf is a bunch of hand-waving and pointing, and there's nothing substantive. The peppered moth. Hey, the peppered moth. Bacteria. Bacteria, man, bacteria. Fruit flies. Darwin's finches. Those are only evidences of this soft form, the statistical distribution form of the grand power that natural selection supposedly has. And as we're seeing, it's pretty weak. It's got some deep circularities in terms of how you define the thing you're looking for within the population that you think is statistically relevant and so forth. Yeah, it's no surprise that they're seeing a classic example in the peppered moth, because you can define the entire thing you're evaluating to show the very thing you're looking for.
So you're seeing trait distribution, but you're not seeing genetic change.
Not by natural selection. Yes, exactly. You see it by artificial selection. We're going to get into that. But you don't see evidences of natural selection making the kind of change that they need.
Okay.
So they've got this gulf that has to be bridged, and they just keep pointing to this kind of stuff and saying, do that long enough and you're going to get the other kind. And we're like, you claim that, but you're not showing it. That's when they appeal to the fossil record. It takes too long. You don't see it here in our lifetimes. It takes too long. But you see it in the fossil record. We'll get into what's wrong with the fossil record. Because notice that all these arguments hang together. They're all pieces of one giant puzzle, which is why we're picking a piece apart and saying, okay, let's really understand this piece. Let's pull this piece apart and really understand this piece. Because, again, this is complex. It's hard. These guys are not stupid. They're not ignorant. They believe what they believe on the basis of good reasoning in general. They're not idiots. They're not just somehow, why can't they just see that there's a God who loves us? They look at us and say, are you so ignorant, stupid, and blind that you can't see all the evidences of why we think what we think? They've got good reasons for thinking what they think. And it's not trivial to pull it apart and do a responsible job of what's actually wrong with the perspective. It takes time and effort, real effort, to understand this stuff to where you can say, yeah, now I really do understand where it goes wrong. So, quick summary now. Natural selection can be thought of in this either deeply circular way in which you're just appealing to a very fluffy notion of change. You see evidence everywhere you look because you've set the bar so low. Or it can be thought of in a way that it wields power that's never been demonstrated to possess. You have two different approaches to thinking about natural selection. They need the second way, but all they can point to as exemplars are the first way. The examples that they point to are this soft, circular, kind of fluffy way of thinking about natural selection, and they infer, on the basis of literally no evidence, that you can get from the one to the other. But the principle has to have the power to literally change species. It's not enough to change trait distribution. You have to actually change species. You have to demonstrate speciation events in principle, and that is way more than just the micro versus macro evolution divide. I really want to emphasize this. We're talking about something far more fundamental than micro versus macro evolution, and creationists are way too quick to grant even microevolution. When you hear the word adaptation, do you think by the word adaptation, for 3 weeks, there are more dark-colored moths than light-colored moths, and 3 weeks later that changes, and you end up having more light-colored moths than dark-colored moths again? Is that what you mean by adaptation? Is that what you mean by microevolution? No. Everybody means by adaptation and microevolution substantive genetic changes in the species that are lasting, right? The species adapted to the environment, not just via a transitory trait change, but via an actual change in the genome that then becomes lasting, that actually changed the species in a lasting way. But that's what we don't see evidence of. So why should we even grant adaptation or microevolution? When we know what that actually means, and now we see what natural selection actually has a demonstrated power to do, and how deeply circular and fluffy those definitions are, why should we as creationists even grant that microevolution takes place? Do you see what I'm saying? Again and again, I will say the same thing. We're fighting the fight on the wrong fronts. We're capitulating on things we should not capitulate on, and thereby granting them entire layers of argumentation that they're not even entitled to. We make the fight even harder on ourselves than we should, because we don't understand what's really going on in evolutionary theory, and because we don't understand it, we keep arguing past them, picking battles on completely the wrong fronts, and fighting totally futile fights. When you get into their paradigm and understand what it's really saying, then you start realizing the extent to which we're fighting the fight on completely the wrong battlefields. We should not be granting adaptation. We should not be granting microevolution. We should not be saying the gulf is between microevolution and macroevolution. It's deeper than that. It's more subtle than that. We should be saying, you haven't even demonstrated that natural selection has the power to produce adaptation, real adaptation. You haven't even demonstrated that natural selection has the power to produce microevolution. You've never demonstrated that. Every evidence you point to, your paradigm examples, are not that. So don't be quick to grant adaptation. Don't be quick to grant microevolution. Make them prove that natural selection has the power to do what their grandiose claims for it actually are. They don't. They haven't demonstrated it. So adaptation is supposed to have this lasting genetic change. We've never observed that that actually occurs. Statistical trait distribution is not change in any relevant sense that matters to us in terms of evolutionary theory. The more you go the direction of the NS argument from change, the more you're anchored in just the argument from change, which really is circular. It's an argumentative form of a tautology. That's where they're anchored. We should not be so quick to capitulate on some of these points. Okay, next week following, we're going to get into what's a species? What would a speciation event even be? Have there been any? Okay? Thank you so much again for your time and attention.